Lawyer, clears throat, firm voice. This will contain something that will change everything. Dead silence. The air feels charged, heavy. Eyes widen, breaths hitch. No one expected this. Daniel, eldest son, voice sharp. What do you mean by that? Lawyer, calm but serious. Mr. Harrison's final wishes are not what you expected. A murmur spreads across the room. Eleanor, the widow, stiffens. Daniel clenches his fists. Claire, the younger daughter, exhales sharply. And at the far end of the table sit three strangers, unfamiliar faces, uninvited, unexplained. Cousin, whispering, confused. Who the hell are they? The lawyer ignores the question. He unfolds the first page of the will. Lawyer, reading, To my beloved son, whom none of you have ever met. The room erupts. Gasps, shock, accusations. Uncle Victor, angry. This has to be a mistake. Widow, trembling, voice shaky. Richard, what have you done? And just like that, the Harrison family's perfect world shatters. Fade to black. A sudden silence fell over the room. The lawyer's words weren't just formalities. They carried weight, something unsettling. A slow shift of glances passed between family members. Eyes that once held confidence now reflected unease. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she clutched the armrest of her chair. Daniel exhaled sharply, straightening his posture, trying to mask his own discomfort. Claire, his younger sister, swallowed hard, a growing pit in her stomach. The tension was suffocating. What if there's something he never told us? A voice whispered. It came from the far end of the table, a distant cousin, leaning forward just enough for his words to carry, but not enough to attract too much attention. The thought was dangerous. This was their father, their family's empire, their legacy. There wasn't room for uncertainty. The lawyer hesitated. That hesitation wasn't lost on anyone. Eleanor's breath hitched. The man who had stood beside her for decades had always been decisive, strong. But now she wasn't sure if she ever truly knew him. Victor shifted in his seat, impatience written all over his face. His fingers tapped against the polished wood of the table, a slow, agitated rhythm. Enough of this nonsense. Just read it, he grumbled. The lawyer's gaze swept over the room before returning to the thick document in front of him. He tightened his grip slightly, as if steadying himself. Mr. Harrison's final will contains details that were not shared with his family during his lifetime. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Claire's pulse quickened. What kind of details? What had their father hidden? And why now? Eleanor's voice, barely a whisper, cut through the silence. Richard, what did you do? Daniel's knuckles turned white as he gripped the arms of his chair. There was no turning back now. Whatever was in that will was about to become their new reality. Then, a knock, sharp, abrupt. Every head turned toward the heavy wooden doors. The sound echoed through the silence, cutting through the tension like a blade. The butler hesitated before stepping inside, his expression tight, uncertain. "Excuse me, sir. There is someone here demanding to be present for the reading." A beat passed. No one spoke. Daniel was the first to break the silence. "Who?" The butler hesitated, glancing toward the lawyer as if seeking permission to speak. His fingers twitched against the tray he carried, the weight of his next words clear before they were even spoken. "He says he's Richard Harrison's son." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Claire stiffened. Victor cursed under his breath, and just like that, the world they knew crumbled. "To my beloved son, whom none of you have ever met." The words sliced through the room like a blade. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The weight of those 10 words pressed down on the family, suffocating, unbearable. Then, "What?" Daniel's voice cracked through the silence like thunder, his chair scraping back as he shot to his feet. Eleanor's face went pale, her lips parting slightly, but no sound came out. Claire's hands trembled as she gripped the table's edge, her knuckles turning white. "What kind of joke is this?" Victor growled, slamming his fist onto the table. The lawyer remained unfazed, his eyes scanning the room, his grip firm on the pages in his hand. "I assure you," he said, his voice calm but unyielding, "this is no joke. Mr. Harrison's instructions were clear. He has left a significant portion of his estate to his son, one none of you have ever met." The words hung heavy in the air, thick with disbelief. "That's impossible," Eleanor whispered, shaking her head. "Richard had no other children. We would have known." The lawyer exhaled slowly, flipping to the next page. "There's more, and it's not what you expect." The tension snapped. Chaos erupted. Daniel lunged forward, his voice raw with anger. "Tell me this is a mistake. My father wouldn't do this." Claire's breathing became erratic. "Who is he?" she demanded, her voice almost desperate. "Who is this so-called son?" The lawyer looked down at the will again, then back up, his gaze steady. "His name is—" A loud bang interrupted him as Victor slammed both fists onto the table. "No!" he snarled, his face red with rage. "We are not going to sit here and listen to this nonsense. Richard was a businessman, a strategist. He would never hide something like this." "And yet he did," the lawyer countered, his voice still eerily steady. Eleanor's chest rose and fell rapidly. This doesn't make sense. Why now? Why keep it a secret?" "Because," the lawyer said, "this was his biggest regret." The room fell still again. For the first time, no one spoke. The weight of those words crushed the outrage, leaving behind only shock, only raw, pulsing disbelief. Eleanor's throat tightened. Daniel's fists clenched. Claire's heart pounded. Regret? Richard Harrison was never a man of regret. "There's still more," the lawyer continued, "and you need to hear it all." No one knew it yet, but the worst was yet to come. Eleanor sat frozen, her mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. For years, she had lived under the belief, the certainty, that Richard's fortune would remain within the family. Their family, his empire, his wealth, his legacy. It was meant for her and their children, not for some stranger, not for a son they had never even heard of. Her hands trembled as she clenched them into fists, nails pressing into her palms. Daniel paced behind her, his frustration barely contained. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered under his breath, his eyes darting toward the will still resting in the lawyer's hands. "This can't be happening." Claire sat motionless, her gaze unfocused. A lump formed in her throat as she recalled the casual conversations she'd had with friends about what she would do once she inherited her share. The dream she had mapped out in her head, gone. Uncle Victor, however, had no patience for silence. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I knew it," he spat. "I knew that old man was hiding something. But this is pure insanity." The murmurs grew louder. Aunt Margaret leaned in, whispering furiously to her husband. One of the cousins, a distant relative who had barely spoken all evening, muttered under his breath about wasted years of loyalty. Even the staff, standing discreetly at the back of the room, exchanged uneasy glances. They all had plans. Eleanor had already spoken with advisors, subtly making arrangements for her inevitable control over the Harrison estate. She had pictured the moment, the power, the security, the wealth. She deserved this. Daniel had his own expectations, expanding his business ventures, further cementing the Harrison name as an empire. Claire had envisioned her future, free from stress, free from financial worry. Even Victor had counted on this. After all, blood was blood, and he was family, wasn't he? Now, all of it, hanging by a thread. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice shaking but laced with quiet fury. "I won't allow this." The room fell silent again. She turned to the lawyer, her eyes blazing. "I want to see the full document, every word, every clause. There must be a mistake." The lawyer hesitated, then carefully slid the thick stack of papers toward her. "Mrs. Harrison," he said carefully, "I understand this is difficult, but I assure you, this is exactly what Mr. Harrison wanted." Eleanor's hands tightened around the will. Then Richard Harrison made the worst mistake of his life. She wasn't going to let everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed, go to someone who wasn't even supposed to exist. Not without a fight. Daniel stared at the will, the words blurring before his eyes. His father, a man he had admired, respected, and in many ways feared, was now a stranger to him. How could this be happening? How could the man who raised him, the man who built an empire, have harbored a secret this colossal? Eleanor gripped the arms of her chair, her face frozen in disbelief. But beneath the shock, something else stirred. Something dark, something dangerous. Doubt. Because now, as she sat there, Richard Harrison's carefully constructed image began to crack. For decades, she had believed she knew her husband completely. The loyal businessman, the devoted father, the calculated strategist who controlled every aspect of his life with precision. But then, the memories came rushing back. The late-night phone calls that ended the moment she entered the room. The business trips that always seemed oddly unplanned. His explanations vague at best. The hidden conversations she once dismissed as paranoia, telling herself, Richard was a busy man. He had a company to run. He had responsibilities. And yet there had been moments where the mask slipped, moments that made her wonder if there was something more beneath his cold, structured demeanor. Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Dad wasn't that kind of man. Claire let out a bitter laugh, her voice laced with something between disbelief and amusement. "Wasn't he?" Daniel shot her a look, but she held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Think about it," she continued, leaning forward. "How many times did he disappear without explanation? How many times did we ask where he was, only to be told it was business?" Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came, because she was right. Victor, who had been silent until now, suddenly let out a slow exhale, rubbing a hand over his face. "I knew something wasn't right, but I never imagined this." All eyes turned to him. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor's voice was sharp, demanding. Victor hesitated, glancing at the lawyer before speaking. "Years ago, Richard came to me," he said, his voice lower now, almost cautious. "He was different, on edge. I remember it because Richard was never the kind of man to be nervous." Daniel leaned in, his frustration growing. And he asked me something strange. He asked what I thought about second chances, about redemption." Eleanor's chest tightened. "Redemption?" she repeated, the word foreign, almost laughable. "Richard never asked for redemption. He never believed he needed it." Victor shook his head. "That's what I thought too." A heavy silence fell over the room. The Richard Harrison they thought they knew, the flawless, powerful, untouchable man, was unraveling before them. And for the first time, his family realized. They had never truly known him at all. The tension in the room was suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the rustling of paper as the lawyer reached for something else inside the folder. It wasn't another page of the will. It was something different. A sealed envelope. His fingers hesitated over it for a moment before he carefully lifted it into view. "This," the lawyer said, his voice carrying an eerie weight, "is a letter written by Mr. Harrison himself. It was not part of the official will, but was left with explicit instructions to be read at this moment." Everyone's eyes locked onto the envelope. The heavy parchment, the familiar scrawl of Richard Harrison's handwriting across the front, but it was the words written on it that sent a chill down their spines. "To the one I failed the most." The room froze. Daniel's fingers twitched against the table, his mind racing. His father was never the type to admit failure. He had built a billion-dollar empire by being relentless, calculated, and unapologetic. Claire swallowed hard, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Eleanor stared at the letter, unblinking. Who was it meant for? Her? One of their children? The son they never knew about? Victor shifted in his seat, his face darkening. "Who is he talking about?" Claire's voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words cut through the air. The lawyer let out a slow breath before carefully opening the envelope. He pulled out a neatly folded letter and adjusted his glasses. "This letter," he said, looking up at them, "will explain why he did what he did and why he kept this secret for so long." The room was dead silent. No one wanted to hear it, and yet no one could look away. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read. "There are many things a man can build in his lifetime, a home, a business, a legacy. But the one thing I could never build was redemption." Eleanor's heart stopped. "To those I have left behind, and to the one I have wronged the most, I ask that you listen. Not to forgive, not to understand, but simply to know the truth. Because the truth is something I have hidden for far too long." Daniel's nails dug into his palms. He had spent his whole life trying to live up to his father's expectations, believing the man was flawless, believing he was the very definition of power and control. But this letter wasn't from a man in control. It was from a man who was haunted. The lawyer continued. "There was a time before all of this, before the wealth, before the power, a time when I made a choice that I could never undo, a choice that changed someone's life forever. And no matter how many years passed, no matter how many empires I built, the weight of that decision never left me." Claire's fingers curled against her lap, her body rigid. "You have spent your lives believing that you knew me, that the man you called father, husband, and brother was a man of reason. But you do not know the truth, and I fear that after this letter you never will see me the same way again." The lawyer paused. The room was thick with anticipation. No one dared to speak. Then carefully he turned the page, and what he read next changed everything. The lawyer took a steady breath, his fingers gripping the edge of the letter as if bracing himself for the storm that was about to follow. Every eye in the room was locked onto him, the tension thick enough to suffocate. "The name of the heir," he began, his voice steady but heavy, "is Michael Carter." The room froze. No one reacted at first. It was as if the words had suspended in the air, waiting to be processed. The name was foreign, unknown. A stranger's name spoken in a place where only family should have been mentioned. And then, a sharp gasp. Eleanor's hand shot up to her mouth, her fingers trembling. Her eyes, wide with something between shock and recognition, darted around the room, as if searching for an explanation. "Who?" Daniel's voice was sharp, demanding. "Who the hell is Michael Carter?" Claire's brows furrowed, confusion twisting her expression. The murmurs started, low at first, then rising like an unstoppable wave. The name meant nothing to them. It wasn't the name of a distant cousin, an estranged relative, or anyone they had ever heard associated with Richard Harrison. Victor let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "I knew it," he muttered under his breath. "I damn well knew it." "Knew what?" Daniel snapped. Victor exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "Richard was always a man of secrets," he said. "But this? A hidden heir? A name no one in this family even recognizes? This is beyond anything I ever expected." The lawyer cleared his throat, regaining their attention. "Michael Carter," he repeated, "is Richard Harrison's biological son, and as per his final will, he is to inherit a significant portion of his estate." Eleanor closed her eyes, her breathing shallow. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. That can't be true." But the way her hands trembled, the way her face had drained of color, said otherwise. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "You know something," he accused, stepping toward her. Eleanor didn't answer. Across the room, a cousin leaned in, their voice hushed but filled with suspicion. "Who is this person? And why did Richard keep him a secret?" No one had an answer, but whatever was coming next was going to tear this family apart. The room was a battlefield of disbelief and tension, a war fought in silence and stolen glances. Eleanor sat frozen, her breath shallow, her eyes darting between the lawyer and the name that had just shattered the illusion of her perfect family. Michael Carter. Who was he? Why had Richard kept him a secret? And why, after all these years, had he chosen to reveal the truth now? Daniel's chair scraped against the polished floor as he shot to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "This has to be a mistake," he barked, pointing a finger at the lawyer. "Some kind of clerical error, a fraud, a scam. My father would never—" But the lawyer, unaffected by the storm raging before him, reached into the folder in front of him and pulled out a stack of documents. He placed them deliberately on the table, his movements slow, controlled. Then he spoke. "These are the official records verifying Michael Carter's claim." He slid the first page forward. "Here is the birth certificate, listing Richard Harrison as the biological father." A hush fell over the room, the weight of those words crushing. Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. Her hands, once poised and steady, shook uncontrollably as she stared at the document. The lawyer placed another sheet on the table. "This is a financial record of child support payments made anonymously over the last 35 years. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "He's lying," he hissed. "Someone faked those records." "These are notarized bank transactions," the lawyer countered smoothly. "Every payment was made under a trust managed by Mr. Harrison himself." Victor let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair. "Well, well," he muttered, shaking his head. "Richard really did have a second life, didn't he?" Claire sat in stunned silence, unable to process what she was hearing. This was too much. And then, the lawyer pulled out one final envelope. "If that isn't enough," he said, sliding it forward, "then this should remove any doubt." Eleanor stiffened, already knowing what was inside. A DNA test. The envelope was opened, the paper unfolded. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and read aloud. "The results show a 99.99% probability that Michael Carter is the biological son of Richard Harrison." A deafening silence. The truth was undeniable. The empire they believed was theirs, was no longer just theirs. It belonged to a stranger. "This is a lie." The words erupted from Daniel's throat like fire, his voice raw with fury. His fists slammed against the table, rattling the delicate crystal glasses, sending a few documents fluttering to the floor. "This, Michael Carter, whoever he is, he's a fraud." His breath was ragged, his face flushed with rage. Claire flinched at the sheer force of his voice, but she didn't disagree. How could this be real? How could they wake up one morning believing their father was one man, only to find out he had been someone else entirely? Victor scoffed, shaking his head. "A fraud?" he repeated, a bitter smirk tugging at his lips. "Daniel, the man left bank statements, legal documents, even a DNA test. What more proof do you need?" "Shut up, Victor," Daniel snapped, turning on his uncle. "You don't get to act like this is just business as usual. This is our family, our legacy." Eleanor, who had remained eerily silent until now, suddenly pushed herself up from her seat. Her movements were slow, deliberate, but her eyes burned with something dangerous, something unforgiving. "How could he betray us like this?" she whispered. No one spoke. Then, louder, her voice shaking, "How could he do this to us?" Her whole body trembled, the years of loyalty, the sacrifices, the blind faith she had placed in Richard, all crumbling in an instant. "I gave him everything," she seethed, her fingers digging into the back of her chair. "I stood by him, I raised his children, I built this life with him. And now you sit here and tell me that he was sending money, our money, to some woman, to some secret child?" Claire finally found her voice. "Who is his mother?" she demanded, turning to the lawyer. "If this is all true, where is she? And why didn't she ever come forward?" The lawyer, calm and composed despite the chaos around him, folded his hands together on the table. "She never came forward," he said smoothly, "because she was never meant to." Eleanor's breath hitched. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" The lawyer exhaled, flipping to the next page in the will. "He had his reasons," he said, his voice firm but heavy. "And you need to hear them." The room fell into a deafening silence. The truth was not finished with them yet. Eleanor's breathing grew erratic. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked gasps. The walls of the grand study seemed to close in around her, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her like an unbearable force. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her dress as the world around her blurred. The voices, the accusations, the arguments, the disbelief became muffled, distant. The sharpness of Daniel's rage, Claire's horror, Victor's bitter amusement, it all faded into a low hum. And then, without warning, her legs gave out. A sharp gasp echoed through the room as she crumpled, her body slumping against the chair before hitting the floor. "Mom!" Claire shrieked, rushing forward, but Eleanor barely registered her daughter's voice. A sharp, cold pressure pressed against her chest, a deep ache settling into her bones. The world spun as she squeezed her eyes shut. Then suddenly, she was somewhere else. The night before his death, Richard's study, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room, the faint sound of ice clinking in his glass as he sat there, staring at the untouched whiskey before him. "Are you coming to bed?" Eleanor's voice had been soft, cautious. Richard hadn't answered immediately. He simply sat there, pensive, his fingers tracing the rim of the glass. "Eleanor," he had murmured, his voice uncharacteristically heavy. She had frowned, stepping closer. "What is it?" A long pause. "If something ever happened to me, promise me you'll try to understand." She had stared at him, confused. Understand what? Richard had exhaled, the kind of exhale that felt like it carried decades of weight. But instead of answering, he had simply given her a long, unreadable look. And then, as if deciding against whatever had been on his mind, he had simply reached for her hand, squeezing it gently before murmuring, "Nothing. Go to sleep, Eleanor." And that had been it. That was the last conversation they ever had. She never thought much of it, never questioned what he had meant. But now, she understood. Her eyes snapped open as a choked sob ripped from her throat. Claire and Daniel were kneeling beside her, their faces hovering above hers, their lips moving as they called her name. But Eleanor barely heard them, because in that moment she knew the truth. Richard had wanted to tell her. He had tried to tell her, and she never saw it, never let herself see it, until it was too late. Daniel's fist slammed onto the table, rattling the remaining papers as his rage boiled over. His voice, sharp and venomous, cut through the suffocating silence. "This is a setup. A damn setup." His breath came fast, chest rising and falling in ragged motions. His world, the legacy he had spent his entire life preparing to inherit, was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. Claire, still kneeling beside Eleanor, turned her tear-streaked face toward him, disbelief and exhaustion in her eyes. "Daniel, stop!" she pleaded. "No, I won't stop," he barked, pointing an accusing finger at the lawyer. "I don't believe a word of this. My father would never have let some nobody steal what belongs to us." Victor let out a dry chuckle from across the room, shaking his head. "Oh, please, Daniel," he scoffed. "You think Richard didn't have secrets? You think he didn't have a life outside of you?" Daniel's rage turned to Victor. "You knew, didn't you?" he seethed, his voice shaking. "All those years you knew something. That's why you're so damn calm right now." Victor leaned back, crossing his arms. "I didn't know," he admitted. "But I suspected. And if you weren't so busy trying to be your father's perfect little soldier, maybe you would have seen the signs too." Claire wiped at her cheeks, her breathing uneven. "Why are we fighting each other?" she whispered. But neither of them paid her any mind. Daniel advanced toward Victor. "You were always jealous of Dad," he sneered, "always bitter that he was the one who built the empire while you stood in his shadow. Now you're just happy to watch it burn." Victor smirked, unbothered. "You're right about one thing, Danny boy. he said coolly. "Your father built an empire, but clearly he built it on lies." Claire flinched. "Stop," she whispered, her voice breaking. No one listened. The words spiraled. Manipulation, deceit, betrayal. The accusations flew like daggers, sharp and relentless. "You're so desperate to hold on to power that you refuse to see the truth. And you're so eager to believe the worst that you're not even questioning the damn timing of all this. What's that supposed to mean?" "It means maybe this Michael Carter isn't the only one playing us." Eleanor groaned softly from the floor, her fingers weakly gripping Claire's wrist, but Claire barely noticed. Her eyes, wide and filled with tears, darted between her brother and uncle as their shouting escalated. She had never seen them like this. They had argued before, of course, all siblings did, but this wasn't just anger. This was desperation. This was destruction. Her father's will hadn't just changed their fortune, it had turned them into enemies. Her breath hitched, her body trembled, and then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she choked out the words that made the entire room freeze. "Was any of this real?" Daniel and Victor stopped mid-sentence. Claire's chest rose and fell as sobs racked her body. Was our family ever real, or was it all just a lie? The weight of her words hung over them, suffocating. No one had an answer. Because deep down, they all feared she was right. The room was still buzzing with tension, the echoes of Claire's words lingering like a ghost no one could shake. The Harrison family, once a symbol of power, wealth, and unity, had been shattered in a single evening. And yet, it wasn't over. Not even close. The lawyer, who had remained composed through the chaos, cleared his throat. The sound cut through the suffocating silence like a blade. "There's something else you all need to know," he said, his voice measured but firm. Daniel's head snapped toward him, eyes still filled with raw fury. "What now?" he spat. The lawyer didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for the final pages of the will, carefully flipping through them. He knew this next revelation would take what was left of the crumbling Harrison dynasty and push it further into the abyss. "There is a clause in Mr. Harrison's final will," he said, glancing at each of them in turn, "that concerns Michael Carter's inheritance." Eleanor, who had managed to pull herself back into her chair, inhaled sharply. "His inheritance?" she echoed, her voice still weak but laced with bitterness. The lawyer nodded. "The will explicitly states that Michael Carter must be present in order to claim his share." A thick, cold silence followed. Claire furrowed her brows, wiping at the remnants of her tears. "But," she whispered, "he's not here." The realization spread across the room like wildfire. Daniel's expression darkened. "Wait, hold on," he said, stepping forward. "Are you saying that all of this, everything, is on hold until this man shows up?" "That is correct," the lawyer confirmed. Victor let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. "Well, isn't that interesting?" he muttered. "All this chaos, and the so-called heir hasn't even bothered to show up." Daniel crossed his arms, his suspicion growing by the second. "And why exactly is that?" The lawyer hesitated, and for the first time that night, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But Daniel caught it. Claire caught it. Even Eleanor, still reeling, noticed it. "Where is he?" Eleanor demanded. The lawyer took a slow breath before finally responding. "He's on his way," he said simply. Daniel narrowed his eyes. On his way from where? The lawyer's silence stretched just a little too long. Victor sat up straighter. "Oh, now this is getting good," he murmured, watching the tension like a spectator at a prize fight. "Tell us the truth," Claire whispered. The lawyer exhaled and finally looked up. "When Michael Carter arrives," he said slowly, "you'll understand everything." The word sent a chill down Claire's spine. Eleanor's breath hitched. Daniel's jaw clenched. Somehow those words were more terrifying than anything that had come before. Because if this was just the beginning, Then what was coming next? The lawyer took a slow breath, his fingers hovering over a separate envelope, one that had remained untouched until now. It was old, its edges slightly worn, sealed in Richard Harrison's handwriting. The weight of it alone seemed to carry years of silence, of regret, of something left unsaid for far too long. The air in the room had shifted. The rage, the chaos, the disbelief, it all quieted, as if some unseen force had pressed pause on their turmoil. "Before Michael arrives," the lawyer said, his voice steady but solemn, "there's something Mr. Harrison wanted you all to hear." Eleanor's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress, her body tense. "What more could he possibly have to say?" she whispered, almost to herself. The lawyer didn't respond. Instead, he carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Then, in a tone laced with something heavier than formality, he began to read. "To the one I should have loved openly, and to the family I have deceived." A sharp intake of breath from Eleanor. Claire's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. Daniel's jaw clenched. "I have spent a lifetime building, creating, and controlling. I have spent years ensuring that every decision I made would be precise, untouchable, immune to mistake. And yet, the greatest mistake of my life was one I have never been able to correct." The room stood still. Her name was Margaret Carter. A sound, half-gasp, half-strangled sob, escaped Eleanor's lips. Daniel turned to her sharply. You know that name." Eleanor's lips quivered. Her shoulders shook. "No," she whispered, but it was barely audible. The lawyer continued. "I met Margaret long before I became the man you all knew. Before the power, before the wealth, before I was Richard Harrison, the businessman. Back then, I was just a man who loved a woman in a way that was all-consuming, reckless, and ultimately impossible." Victor exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "Jesus," he muttered. "We were young," the lawyer read on, "and the world did not want us together. My family disapproved. My ambitions demanded sacrifices, and I—" A pause. "I chose to walk away." Silence. Eleanor shut her eyes, her mind reeling. "I told myself it was for the best, that love and business could not coexist, that I could build a life with stability, wealth, and influence, that I could have everything except her." Claire swallowed hard. "But I was wrong. Because when I walked away, I left behind more than just a love story." The lawyer's grip on the letter tightened slightly. His next words came softer, yet somehow heavier. "I left behind a son." A shudder went through Eleanor's body. Daniel froze. Claire's lips parted in shock. "I never told her why I left. I never gave her the truth. And for years I justified my silence. But no amount of money, no business deal, no carefully controlled empire could erase the regret that haunted me every single day." The words hung in the air like a curse. Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her chest, her heartbeat frantic, her breath shallow. She had spent her life by Richard's side. She had believed in him, trusted him, stood in his shadow and built their life together. And now, in the space of a single letter, she realized she had been living a lie. Eleanor's breathing was uneven, her fingers digging into the armrests of her chair. The name Margaret Carter echoed in her mind like a haunting melody she could never forget. She didn't need the lawyer to explain who she was. She already knew. Daniel sat stiffly, his knuckles white as his grip tightened around the edge of the table. His father, the man he had idolized, the man he had tried his whole life to impress, had spent his final years consumed by a secret none of them had seen coming. Claire wiped at her tear-streaked face, her body still trembling. This isn't real," she murmured. But it was. The lawyer let out a slow breath, giving them a moment to process before continuing. His tone remained even, but there was something behind it now, something heavier, more personal. "Mr. Harrison never forgave himself for what he did," he said. A sharp silence filled the room. "He left Margaret Carter behind thinking he was making the right decision, He convinced himself that money, power, and legacy were more important than the love he had for her. But as the years passed, the weight of that decision never left him. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Richard was never a man to show weakness, the lawyer continued, not to his family, not to his business partners, but in private, the regret was unbearable. Victor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You mean to tell me that the great Richard Harrison, the man who ruled his empire like a damn king, was sitting in his mansion mourning the life he could have had? The lawyer nodded. He kept tabs on Margaret for years, though he never reached out. He watched from a distance, knowing he had abandoned not just her, but their son. Daniel's fists slammed against the table. And yet he still didn't tell us? His voice cracked with rage. He just let us believe that we were his only family. The lawyer placed another document on the table, this one far thinner than the others, a single handwritten note, separate from the will. He wanted to fix his mistake, the lawyer said, but by the time he gathered the courage to do it, it was too late. Daniel snatched the note, his eyes scanning the words written in his father's own hand. I thought time would erase my sins, that if I built enough, earned enough, I could silence the past. But every night when I closed my eyes, the only thing I saw was what I left behind. My greatest failure was believing I had more time. Daniel's throat tightened. He shoved the note away, as if touching it burned him. So this was his way of making things right? Throwing half of everything he built at this stranger? The lawyer folded his hands, his expression unreadable. Mr. Harrison knew he couldn't undo the past. He knew no amount of money could change what had already happened, but his final decision, the only thing he could do in the end, was to make sure Michael Carter got what was rightfully his. Eleanor's voice, barely a whisper, cut through the tension. And what about us? Her face was hollow, her body weak, but there was something sharp in her eyes. Did we mean so little to him that we had to find out like this? The lawyer hesitated. No, he said softly. But in his mind, this was the only way left to tell you the truth. A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard Harrison had spent his life building an empire, but in the end, it was guilt, not wealth, that dictated his final move. And now his family was left to pick up the pieces. The room was heavy with the weight of betrayal, regret, and unanswered questions. The air itself seemed to pause, as if the very walls of the Harrison estate were listening in on the chaos. Then, a knock at the door. It wasn't a polite, hesitant tap. It was firm, certain, inevitable. Every head turned. The tension spiked, as if the house itself had inhaled and was now holding its breath. The butler hesitated for a brief moment before stepping forward and pulling open the grand wooden doors. And there he was, Michael Carter. He wasn't what they expected. They had imagined a desperate man, someone looking for a paycheck, a leech trying to claim what wasn't his. But the man standing in the doorway didn't look like a lost son of fortune. He looked like a storm waiting to break. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark eyes scanned the room with a quiet intensity. His presence was like a crack of thunder before the rain, a silent promise that something was about to change. Eleanor's breath hitched. Daniel stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. Claire wiped at her swollen eyes, unable to look away. Michael took a step forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I never wanted this money. The words slammed into the room like a wrecking ball. Everyone stilled. I just wanted the truth. Eleanor exhaled shakily, gripping the edge of the table, her body trembling. You're lying, Daniel said, his voice low and dangerous. You expect us to believe that? Michael didn't flinch. Believe what you want, he said evenly. I didn't come here for wealth, I came here for answers. Victor chuckled darkly, shaking his head. That's a hell of a way to introduce yourself, kid. Michael's gaze hardened. I'm not a kid, and I'm not your problem. Daniel took a sharp step forward, his anger bubbling back to the surface. You are if you think you're walking in here and taking everything our father built. Michael tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Our father? The way he said it, almost amused, almost cruel, sent a ripple through the room. Eleanor swallowed hard. Something felt off. Claire, barely breathing, finally whispered what they were all thinking. Who are you? Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes flickered to the lawyer. You haven't told them yet, have you? The lawyer adjusted his glasses, exhaled, and finally spoke. No. Michael smirked, but there was no warmth in it. Then let's fix that. And just like that, the story twisted again, because Michael Carter wasn't who they thought he was. And the truth was still waiting to be revealed. The silence in the room was deafening. Every breath felt measured, every heartbeat loud. Michael Carter stood at the center of it all, his presence a storm that had only just begun to unleash its fury. But before anyone could speak, before the next accusation could be hurled, the lawyer did something that made the tension snap like a live wire. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another envelope. It was smaller than the others, its edges worn, its seal unbroken. But it wasn't just any letter. The bold, familiar handwriting on the front made Eleanor gasp so sharply it was almost a choke. Richard Harrison's handwriting. The room tilted. No, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. The lawyer placed the envelope onto the table, resting his fingers over it, as if steadying himself for the impact of what he was about to say. This, he said slowly, is Mr. Harrison's second will. Claire let out a soft, broken gasp. Daniel froze. Victor muttered a curse under his breath. Michael Carter, however, did not react, not even a blink. That was when Eleanor realized. Her breath shook. She whipped toward him, eyes wild, voice rising. You knew. Michael finally looked at her, and his expression said it all. The shock Eleanor expected to see wasn't there. The confusion, the disbelief, none of it was there. He had known all along. You knew about this, didn't you? Eleanor's voice cracked, but it wasn't just with anger. It was fear. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about inheritance. This wasn't just about an affair. This was something bigger. Michael let out a slow exhale, his gaze steady. I've always known the truth, he admitted, his voice unshaken, unreadable. Daniel's fury erupted. What the hell does that mean? He roared, stepping forward, his rage ready to explode. If you knew, why did you come here? Why now? Michael met his glare without flinching. Because now you're finally ready to hear it. The words sent chills down Claire's spine. Eleanor felt her world spin, her pulse erratic, her throat dry as she stared at the second will, still untouched on the table. Why? She whispered, her voice barely a breath. Why did he do this? Michael tilted his head, his dark eyes piercing through her. Because Richard Harrison wasn't the man you thought he was. The lawyer slowly slid the envelope closer, the weight of it growing heavier with every second. This, he said, changes everything. And just like that, the truth they thought they had finally uncovered had only been the beginning. The weight of the second will sat heavy on the table, untouched, yet suffocating. Every eye in the room was locked onto it, but no one dared to move. No one dared to be the first to open the final secret Richard Harrison had left behind. Michael Carter didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. Because whatever was inside that envelope, he already knew. The lawyer finally broke the silence, his fingers carefully sliding across the sealed paper, his breath measured, almost hesitant. Mr. Harrison left this will with specific instructions, he said. It is not a replacement for the first, but rather an explanation. A pause. And a confession. Eleanor's breath hitched. Daniel's body stiffened. Claire's hands clutched the chair so tightly her knuckles went white. No one spoke. Then, slowly, deliberately, the lawyer broke the seal and unfolded the final will. His eyes scanned the first few lines before he cleared his throat and began to read. To my family, and to the one who was never meant to be a secret, Michael inhaled sharply, just once, but he didn't react beyond that. If you are reading this, then you have already learned part of the truth. You know about Margaret. You know about the son I abandoned. You know that I built a life on a foundation that was already cracked. But there is something you still don't understand, something you need to know before you judge me for the choices I made. Eleanor's heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears. The truth is, Michael Carter was never meant to inherit my fortune. He was meant to inherit something far greater. The room froze. The lawyer's hands shook slightly as he turned the page. I have spent my entire life crafting an empire, but in the end, my greatest mistake was believing that wealth was the most valuable thing I could leave behind. Money does not erase the past. It does not rebuild what was lost. And so I have chosen to leave something else. Daniel leaned forward, his rage shifting into something else entirely. A desperate need to know. "What is he saying?" Claire whispered. The lawyer swallowed hard before reading the next line. "My greatest regret is not that I left Margaret, but that I abandoned my son to a fate worse than being fatherless. A fate I knew about. A fate I did nothing to stop." Michael closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Eleanor to realize. He had been waiting for these words. "What fate?" Eleanor's voice was barely a breath. The lawyer turned the page. "Michael Carter never needed my money. What he needed was justice. Because what happened to his mother, what happened after I left, is something I can never undo. Something I should have stopped." A suffocating silence. Then Michael spoke. "My mother didn't die in an accident," he said, his voice low, steady. "She was murdered." Eleanor choked on air. Claire's hand shot over her mouth. Daniel's face drained of color. The lawyer kept reading. "For years, I told myself I left Margaret behind for the sake of my career, my legacy. But the truth is, when I walked away, I left her vulnerable. I left her in the hands of people who wanted to erase her, to keep my secret buried forever. And when she tried to reach out, when she finally found the courage to expose the truth, she was silenced." Victor let out a breath that sounded almost like a curse. "You're telling me someone had her killed?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I already know who." His voice was dangerous now. Daniel swallowed, stepping forward. "Who?" Michael finally turned his gaze toward Eleanor. Straight at her. Eleanor's breath stilled. Michael's next words changed everything. "Your husband wasn't protecting me. He was protecting you." The world collapsed. A thick silence swallowed the room whole. Michael's words hung in the air, their weight so unbearable that no one could move. Eleanor's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table. Her breath was erratic, her vision blurry. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, that's not true. Richard, he wouldn't—" "He did," Michael interrupted coldly. "He knew the truth. He knew what happened to my mother. And instead of bringing the people responsible to justice, he chose to protect them." Daniel shook his head aggressively, refusing to accept it. "You're lying," he barked. "My father wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a murderer." "No," Michael agreed, "but he knew who was." The implication was deafening. Eleanor paled. Claire, whose body had been trembling in the chair, suddenly pushed back violently, sending it crashing to the floor. "How long?" she choked out, her voice raw. Eleanor blinked at her daughter, her lips quivering. "Claire, How long did you know?" Claire screamed, her voice shaking the walls. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed. That was the answer. The realization hit Claire like a gut punch. She staggered backward, covering her mouth as if the truth itself would suffocate her. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You knew." Daniel turned to his mother slowly, as if seeing her for the first time. "Tell me this isn't true." His voice wasn't full of rage anymore. It was something worse, something empty. Eleanor didn't answer. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, rubbing a shaking hand over his face. "My whole life," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, "my whole life I defended this family. I fought for this family. I stood by my father, by you, and the whole time, you were hiding this." Eleanor reached for him, her voice desperate. "Daniel, please." He jerked away from her touch. "Don't." His voice was ice cold. Victor let out a bitter chuckle from across the room. "I knew Richard had his secrets," he muttered, "but this is something else." Claire scoffed, shaking her head. "This family is a goddamn joke." She turned sharply, storming toward the door. "Claire, where are you going?" Eleanor pleaded. Claire didn't stop. "As far away from you as I can," she spat, without looking back. She disappeared down the hall. Daniel stood there, silent, staring at the floor. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled shakily and turned toward Michael. "Take it," he said, voice hollow. Michael frowned slightly. "What?" Daniel gestured toward the documents, the empire, the wealth that had caused nothing but destruction. "Take it all," he said, his voice breaking. "It means nothing to me anymore." And just like that, he walked out. No rage, no fight, just quiet resignation. Michael watched him go before turning back to Eleanor. The once powerful matriarch sat there, her hands limp in her lap, her body hollow. Everything she had built, everything she had held on to for years, was gone. She was alone. Michael finally stepped back, exhaling slowly. "I didn't come here for the money," he said. "I came for the truth." Eleanor looked up at him, tears falling freely now. Michael stared at her for a long moment. Then, just as he reached the doorway, he spoke one last time. "And now that I have it, I never want to see any of you again." He stepped out without looking back, and with that, the Harrison family was no more. Eleanor sat motionless, staring at the papers before her. The empire Richard built, the wealth that had once felt untouchable, it all belonged to Michael now. Yet, he wasn't reaching for it. The lawyer cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, "as the legal heir named in Richard Harrison's will, you have the right to claim the estate and all financial assets under his name." Michael remained still. Eleanor's breath was shaky, her body weak as she waited for the inevitable. The moment he would take everything, the moment her world, already shattered, would be buried beneath his feet. Instead, he did something no one expected. "I don't want it." Eleanor's head snapped up. The lawyer hesitated. "Mr. Carter." Michael let out a slow, measured breath before he stepped back from the table, hands in his pockets. "I never came here for money," he said. "And I sure as hell don't need it now." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "You're lying," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You wouldn't have come all this way just to leave with nothing." Michael's eyes darkened, but there was no anger in them, only certainty. "I came for the truth," he said, "and now I have it." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Eleanor shook her head, disbelief settling in. "You would walk away? From everything?" Michael's lips twitched slightly, but there was no amusement in it. "This fortune destroyed your family," he said. "I'm not about to let it destroy me, too." The words hit harder than any legal document ever could. The lawyer cleared his throat again, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Carter, if you decline the inheritance, the estate will be left to—" "I don't care," Michael interrupted, turning toward the door. "Let the vultures fight over the scraps. I'm done here." Eleanor felt the panic rising in her chest, not because she wanted him to take the money, but because she needed him to. Because if he took it, she could hate him. If he took it, she could justify what Richard had done. But now she was just left with the truth. And the truth was worse than losing the money. Michael stopped at the threshold, his back still to her. "Your husband spent his whole life trying to fix a mistake he never had the courage to face," he said quietly. Then, with a final glance over his shoulder, he added, "You should think about what you're running from too." And then he was gone. Eleanor sat there, staring at the untouched fortune, and for the first time in her life, It felt completely worthless. The grand estate, once filled with the echoes of laughter, of family gatherings, of legacy, now stood silent. The weight of what had been lost lingered in every corner, a ghost of what was once called the Harrison family. Eleanor sat alone at the long dining table, the same table where countless dinners had been shared, where Richard had once sat at the head, commanding the room with his presence. But now there was no one left. She traced her fingers along the polished wood, her mind drifting to the past, a past that now felt like a cruel illusion. Flashback, a young Daniel and Claire giggling as they chased each other through the halls. Richard sitting at the table, newspaper in hand, shaking his head playfully as Claire climbed onto his chair. Eleanor standing in the kitchen, smiling softly as she watched her family. The life she had believed in. The image flickered, distorted, before vanishing completely. It was all gone. Daniel had left, disappearing without a word, rejecting everything tied to his father's name. Claire had cut ties completely, refusing to answer calls, walking away from the family that had deceived her. Victor, once the ever-present shadow, had made his stance clear. This wasn't his fight. He had taken what little he was given and walked away, unwilling to be a part of the wreckage. Michael Carter, the son who had unknowingly burned the foundation of their empire to the ground, had left without hesitation, choosing truth over wealth, disappearing into the world Richard had kept him hidden from. And Eleanor had nothing left. She had spent decades upholding the illusion of a perfect family, a perfect marriage, a perfect legacy, only to find out that it had been built on lies. The world she had once controlled had crumbled, leaving behind only an empty house and the ghosts of the past. She lifted a trembling hand to wipe a stray tear, but the truth remained, unshaken, unrelenting. The Harrison family was no more, and nothing could ever put it back together. Eleanor sat by the grand window of the Harrison estate, staring at the vast, empty land stretching before her. The setting sun cast long shadows over the mansion, its golden light illuminating the remnants of a family that no longer existed. The empire was still there, the wealth, the power, the influence, all untouched. But what was an empire without the people to inherit it? Without the family to hold it together? She let out a slow breath, her fingers running along the edge of the chair where Richard once sat. His presence still lingered in these walls, but not in the way she had once believed. For years she thought this was about money, about securing her family's legacy, about ensuring that the name Harrison would remain untouchable. But in the end, it had never been about money. It had been about truth. And truth, unlike wealth, could not be controlled. Daniel had spent his entire life trying to prove himself to a father who had been hiding his greatest failure. Claire had trusted in the bonds of their family, only to watch them shatter in front of her. And Eleanor had built her world around a lie, refusing to see the cracks forming beneath her feet until it was too late. She closed her eyes, memories flooding her mind. Richard's last words to her. "If something ever happened to me, promise me you'll try to understand." She had dismissed it at the time. She had refused to see. Now she understood, but understanding came too late. Michael Carter had walked away from the fortune, leaving it untouched. He hadn't come for revenge. He hadn't come for wealth. He had come for answers. And he had found them. Eleanor exhaled sharply, staring at the empty seat across from her, where Richard had once sat. Was this about money, or about finding the truth? She already knew the answer, and it haunted her. Because in the end, money could be inherited. But truth was something you had to face. And sometimes the price of knowing the truth was losing everything else. If this story gripped you, made you question loyalty, truth, and the weight of secrets, then don't stop here. What would you choose? Wealth built on lies or truth that shatters everything? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories filled with suspense, betrayal, and shocking twists, hit that like button and subscribe for the next one. The truth is always waiting to be uncovered. Are you ready to face it?